Now, Tassos Aniotis, Special Advisor for Sustainable Productivity Forum for the Future of Agriculture. The uncertainties stemming from the outlooks in areas of EU interests.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity, naturally for the opportunity of getting into a public discussion. Some of the questions I've been having on the one hand, following developments in commodity markets together with John since 2010, I remember the previous financial crisis. And at the same time, in recent years, after I retired, working in two research projects, in the advisory report of two research projects of the Commission, and focusing exactly on the type of baseline that is needed, and the sort of inconsistency sometimes in the numbers that we have been using. So the title of my presentation is a little bit for a LinkedIn type of article, but let me clarify. When you see any type of outlook exercise, and I've dirtied my hands with these exercises for many, many years in my career in the Commission, the first thing that comes in mind is everything is linear trend. Whether it's blissful or not is in the eye of the beholder. One thing I made clear in my LinkedIn article is don't shoot the messenger. So the focus here on the OECD FAO exercise is not to criticize what has come out, because a lot of it is based on the constraints, on the assumptions they have to use, which are also given to them by other type of international organizations or administrations. But to try to identify whether these numbers make sense, and if they don't, what type of policy implications we have. And my focus here is not going to be in the whole report, and as all of these reports, you better read all of them to realize the wealth of information they have and not identify only the areas of question marks, but also the angle was also at the end, as you will see, the EU focused. So the markets are rapidly changing. And what is coming out from this OECD FAO report is that they're changing on the production side, where clearly, if you look at the 4 Fs of agriculture, when it comes to feed and fuel, we have strong growth. When it comes to food, we have a pretty slow growth nonetheless, population-driven. When it comes to fiber, we have stagnation. We have many players in food commodities, fewer players in feed, which includes soybeans, and trade increasingly plays a role to cover emerging deficits. And when it comes to livestock and feed, this is driven by income growth. When it comes to food, mainly wheat and rice, this is driven by population growth. When you look at the consumption side, Asia and Africa are now somewhere between 50 and 75% of global consumption, depending on the products you're looking at. China's population is not really growing that much, if at all, so its demand is also not growing as much as in the past, although it's still growing because of income growth. India, Southeast Asia, and Africa dominate increases in demand. And the OECD is losing its consumption share everywhere, partly as a result of stagnant population growth and partly as a result of dietary shifts, which are slow but are steady over the years. And when you look at the trade landscape, what we have new here is global tensions that disturb trade. And the impact of the Russian invasion in Ukraine on wheat and grain markets is the mostly felt. We don't know where we're going to go with the other type of tensions that are accumulating right now. Food security risks and the role of trade is, in my view, often underestimated, and that distorts foreign policy priorities. You cannot address some of these problems by limiting trade. You do exactly the opposite. And what we have had, especially in the European context, but also globally, this polarization between climate change and food security that treats the two as substitutes instead of complements. Now, a couple of graphs to focus on the areas I've looked more. First of all, on wheat, which is the dominant in terms of food crop. And what you see here is an expectation for some slowdown, but a clear growth. In the bottom, you have area in the bar. On top, you have the green line is production, the dotted line is yields, and the other line in the bottom, the purple one, is exports. If you look at the details of what explains that, you see that it's not mainly driven by area. What you have with a green bar is the cumulative area growth over a 10-year period. So we had a decline, in fact, in area between 2010 and 20. What OECD and FAO expect is that we're going to find some area, but not as much as maybe would have been needed. Yields will grow, also at a slower rate than before. In my view, what is happening in wheat is a reflection of major changes that we've seen, and I try to summarize in what is a rather complex slide that I will put in step by step. First of all, if you look over 20 years, what happened in the major players, what you have is the cumulative change in their surplus, and I need to put it somewhere there so people understand it. So it's the difference between production and consumption, a cumulative over 20 years. And I grouped together some players, EU and US, because they were the traditional big giants of the past, Australia, Canada, and Argentina as the other traditional exporters, Brazil, China, and India because they're monsters in terms of agriculture overall, but not in terms of wheat. Russia and Ukraine, because of what you see there, a cumulative 54 million tons change in their surplus, which basically covered the 50 million tons deficit, increase in deficit in Africa, the rest of Latin America, and the rest of Asia. So that is the last 20 years. We look at the next 20 years, this is what is coming out from the outlook exercise. And I try to put it in this graph. So you have the traditionals here, and one of the things that surprises me is that the EU is expected to increase significantly its exports, and so is, or the net surplus, if you want, and so is Australia, Canada, and Argentina. So it's only the US that stays relatively stable in terms of the surplus. When you look into Russia and Ukraine, Ukraine loses some of the gains it had had, which is natural. I mean, the assumption there is the war ends relatively soon, which is something we all hope and wish. But what is also clear is that it will take quite some time, whenever the war ends, to clean all the demine all the areas that have been totally destroyed and come back to production. So what you come up is with a scenario where Russia is feeding the world, or at least sub-Saharan Africa. So it's a case where food security and global security come together with any sign you want to place on it. And that's what is happening with the net importers, a very significant increase in the deficits of Africa and of the rest of Asia. And the big difference here is that the rest of Asia generates income growth that allows it to import this wheat. You can't say the same thing for all parts of Africa. Unlike wheat, maize, which is essentially for feed here, because fuel is relatively stable in the outlook exercise, maize is expected to continue the current path with very few players, so the US and Brazil will keep exporting a lot to cover the deficits essentially of the rest of Asia and also of China. So I'm not going to focus more, but these are the two regions of the world that explain what the growing deficits that drive this demand. And here's my question mark. Is the expected supply response realistic? For years now, we have been witnessing with a lot of variability in the US, a steady decline in the production of wheat. This is not the case. I think it's not mainly driven by OCDFAO, but by the USDA, which has been, for many years now, much more optimistic about what will happen in the future than what is realistically happening. If you add to that the other Canada, Australia, Argentina expectations on wheat, you come up with a situation that might appear, in my view, more optimistic than what is realistic. And that adds problems to what is already a difficult situation in wheat markets, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. If you look at the expected changes in regional land uses and emissions, and here there is a different angle from the one that is coming from the analysis that Petra presented, what you see is a very significant continuation of increases in land at slower rate than in the past in the deficit areas, Southeast Asia, in sub-Saharan Africa, and also some, very little in Latin America. And if you go to the right in terms of emissions, on the vertical side, you have the annual change in emissions. On the horizontal one, you have the annual change in production, in percentage terms. The blue is Europe and Central Asia, so that's where the European Union is in. And that's the only part of the world where you have an increase in production with a decline in emissions. So a production of more with less. If you isolate the EU from there, you have a much more impressive increase in production and a decline in emissions. Everywhere else, we have different degrees of increases in production with a simultaneous increase of emissions. And that raises all sorts of policy questions, not only about what we have to do to change this, but also in terms of, you want, of a self-flagellating habit we have in the European Union, because we must be doing something good if we manage to produce more with less. The fact that we have to do it even better doesn't mean that we shouldn't recognize that something has already been happening. And that you see it much more clearly in milk production, because on the left, what you have on the horizontal axis is percentage changes in inventory, so the number of cows, to put it. The less cows, the less methane emissions, even if you assume that technologies haven't changed and the feeding requirements haven't changed. And here, again, the European Union is standing out as reducing significantly its herd, while at the same time vertically increasing its yields. On the right-hand side, you have mostly importers, except for the US, that is an exporter. What is interesting in this graph is that it indicates where we're going to have a reduction in emissions automatically on the left-hand side, but it raises a question mark. What I have been hearing from the ground and from the industry is that while clearly there is a very strong demand for dairy products in Asia especially, there is no doubt about this, the capacity of the major producers like the European Union and New Zealand to respond to that is not necessarily there because of environmental constraints. So that's another area that could imply that if the outcome is not exactly what is coming out from the outlook, then we might have an even higher pressure on prices. So if you summarize these global uncertainties, first of all, we have a problem on food inflation. It's a global problem, as we saw from the graphs that John presented, but it's a problem that has been more acute than any other place in the European Union. So there is a huge gap between what EU producers touch and what EU consumers pay that requires a much closer analysis in the root causes, and everybody that has tried to look at transparency in the food chain, good luck to all of you, and if you have managed, let us know how you did it. Especially because of these distorted price transmission signals acts as a major disincentive for green transition. I mean, you have had all these arguments, in my view, very often presented in the most arrogant way. I've always said that food has to become more expensive to internalize externalities. Food became much more expensive, and it didn't internalize any externalities. So there is no space to ask for higher food prices at the consumers right now, which means that we have to ask for something different. I'll tell you afterwards what, in my view, this should be. The energy uncertainty, I will go very fast on it, but it's extremely important. Natural gas is used 70% of it to produce nitrogen fertilizer. Well, if the price in the US is 1/4 of the price in Europe, the same industry is having a completely different competitive situation, and that complicates the shift towards precision farming and best practices, because some of the best fertilizers, the more targeted fertilizers, are nitrogen-based and not bulk fertilizers. And when it comes to geostrategic tensions, I mean, we are in Europe. What the war in Ukraine means for Europe is in our minds all the time. One of the things that, in my view, we haven't really focused much is what is the potential role of Ukraine integrated, whatever the path is in the European Union, with Ukraine playing a role not in supplying the domestic EU market of today, but globally the increasing deficits, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Because this implies a completely different path of adjustments and policy recommendations and otherwise. Tensions in sub-Saharan Africa are, in my view, generally underestimated in our policy debate. And I think there is an emerging time bomb. And when it comes to energy and raw material dependence, we are unfortunately dependent on almost everything, and one of the things that surprised me is we had a report on competitiveness in the European agricultural, and the sector in Europe that is one of the most competitive, that's the agri-food, went missing. So two graphs that you've seen it, I just put all the graphs of John together, so you clearly see on the right-hand side how important addressing food inflation is, because the issue here is not whether food inflation goes down. It's going to go to zero, let's say. The thing is that the level of food prices is going to be so high that it will have an impact on the capacity of consumers to respond, and also on the type of products that they will be asking, and that's the natural gas disadvantage we face. So my last slide, in a changing world, has the policy debate adapted? I put a question mark. My feeling is no, or at least not in the manner that it should be. And there are three areas where I think we need to focus the debate. The first one is productivity. If food gradually became cheap, it is through productivity growth. Yes, it was productivity growth that ignored the environmental impact. But in our times, there are plenty of examples that indicate that you can shift the supply curve to the right by actually increasing your productivity and reducing the environmental footprint at the same time. What we haven't done is actually communicate these concrete examples, because by doing that, we will be able to gradually reduce the level of food prices without hurting the environment. Crucial here, of course, is the type of prospects on price developments. And there are refinements on the analysis that we can do. And the same thing applies when we focus on agricultural inputs. I think it's very positive that now we have fertilizers in the models that produce the outlook for OECD and FAO. In Europe, we depend on energy and science for these inputs. And unfortunately, both of them are acting as a constraint right now. And energy for what I mentioned before. Science, because here we have another schizophrenic attitude. I mean, at a certain point, we have to, first of all, ask ourselves a question. What do we do to address this long-term deterioration of the terms of trade for agriculture, the last graphs that John indicated? And what we have to do is focus on new knowledge that depends on and is produced by science. And at a certain point, we have to ask ourselves, what's so different between human health and animal health applications of biotechnology, plant health applications of biotechnology? It cannot be that you have to do one thing in one and another thing in the other, although here we have some risks on the other side of the Atlantic right now in terms of vaccination of children and applications of science. And finally, I think Peter also alluded to that, we do have to start focusing on ways and harmonizing the ways of measuring the carbon footprint. We talk about carbon tariffs, carbon taxation, carbon subsidies, carbon what? I mean, to be able to price something accurately, you need to know what it is as a product of some kind. And here we have all sorts of different methodologies that have not been carbonized. And finally, my question, who's afraid of trade? Especially in the European Union, who continues to be above all a free trade area. Without the productivity boost that we need, we're going to lose global influence, because the food sector is one of the sectors that is among the most competitive in the European Union on the export side. We have to address growing food insecurity with more trade, especially in the parts of the world that will need it. But we also have to admit and understand one thing. I was in Greece last week, and 1 month or so ago, and one of the things that was asked is what happens with free trade agreements. And guess what? With all the catastrophological debate, Greece is one of the biggest winners in these agreements. And that has always been the case for as long as I remember. But part of it has to do with the fact that trade increases overall welfare, but generates winners and losers, and the winners often forget to compensate losers with the right mechanism. So that's something we need to keep in mind. With that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks to Tassos Aniotis.